Hey guys, welcome back to Philosophy for Flourishing, the show where we explore principles and practices for living the best, most fulfilled life possible. I'm recording this on December 31st. It'll probably come out sometime early next year. And I wanted to take a minute to reflect on one of my favorite books from 2021. It's called The Scout Mindset by Julia Galef. And along with Adam Grant's book, Think Again, which also came out earlier this year, I think that these two together are two books by people I'd say are in the social sciences. Julia Galef is not a professor at a university like Adam Grant is, but she's working in the field. But the point of both books, I think, is to help people become better thinkers and get a more clear grasp of reality. In fact, the subtitle of Julia's book is Why Some People See Things Clearly and Others Don't. And that's the whole theme of the book right there. Seeing the world more clearly, why perhaps you don't already see it as clearly as you can, and what we can do to change that. And it's all about this thing called the Scout Mindset. So Galef, for a few years, was when she first got on this track of trying to teach people how to think better, and the way I'd put it is think more objectively. She spent a couple years teaching, from what I understand, workshops on logic, on common cognitive biases, on common fallacies of reasoning. And she learned in that time, though, that knowledge alone of these basic fields related to reasoning, logic, and cognitive biases, just having that knowledge alone is not enough to apply it. It's not enough to become a better reasoner. There are lots of people that know logic really well and still do really poorly when it comes to reasoning. And what she says is that we need more than knowledge. And if you look at the history of philosophy, there's a nice parallel here. Socrates thought that virtue in essence was knowledge, that if you really knew something, then you were basically incapable of flouting that knowledge. You couldn't act against something that you really knew. And Aristotle brings this issue up in his Nicomachean Ethics. Scholars sort of debate where he comes down on this, but he makes the argument that, this just on its face is false, and what is required to be a virtuous person is not just knowledge of what virtue is, but also this active condition, or hexis in the Greek, of acting on that knowledge and what we would today call a habit. And that's really what Galef is getting at in terms of the Scout Mindset. And she contrasts Scout Mindset to soldier mindset. And this is a really helpful analogy. She talks about how the soldier, his job is to win at any price. So when he goes out onto the battlefield, his job is to win. And if you think about the way that people approach arguments today, I was astounded recently watching the Rubin Report with, I think her name is Kayleigh McEnany. She was the press secretary in Trump's White House there at the tail end. And she says that at one point, the motto for our office was offense only. And we are out there trying to win arguments. And that's how a lot of people, I think, approach life in general. And you can't blame McEnany for that sort of... she immediately goes on to talk about how the press corps that she had to deal with was essentially doing the same thing for the opposite side. So it's baked into our system, and it's unfortunate but true that we have this sort of team sports mentality when it comes to politics, and even when it comes to the news and reporting, which is not what we want, right? We want to be able to get at the truth. And so the soldier has a motivation to win. The scout, by contrast, when he goes out to survey the land, there's no inducement for him to pretend, for instance, that there is a bridge in some strategic location when there actually isn't, or that there is a weakness in the enemy's line where there actually isn't. Because if his mental picture or in his case, actual map of what's going on is wrong, that will lead to bad strategy and to failure. So the scout doesn't have a motivation to change what he's seeing. He's motivated, but motivated toward accuracy. And that is the idea behind scout mindset, is to have a personal motivation in having a very accurate view of the world. And this is interesting because today there are lots of psychologists who point to the supposed benefits of fooling ourselves, of sugarcoating our view of the world. So Galef mentions a book by a couple psychologists called Mistakes Were Made, but Not by Me. Love the passive voice. And in that, they actually point out the problems with what Galef calls motivated reasoning, what psychologists call motivated reasoning, which is reasoning motivated by some alternative agenda. It's basically a less sinister synonym for rationalization, using reason not as a means of getting at the truth, but as a means of sort of justifying what one already believes. And that phenomena, self-justification, which is what psychologists observe people doing, we probably all have done plenty of times in our own lives, is we make a decision and then we think back about it. We're not really sure if we made the right decision, but we sort of go through this process of self-justification, of justifying to ourselves again why we did the right thing. And sometimes this is a process in which we're actually engaged with thinking about the facts, and our thinking is actually tied to those facts, and we're telling ourselves the truth, and other times we're actually just rationalizing. And Galef also points to another example from Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize winning psychologist. And I believe it was in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, where he talks about how motivated reasoning and self-justification are important to personal resilience. Because if we look back at things that perhaps we could have done better, or things we just blatantly effed up on, with things we did wrong, we're likely to just continuously beat ourselves up over that unless we engage in some self-justification, in Kahneman's view. And Galef says, no, look, this is actually not your only option. You don't have to fool yourself at all. In fact, the truth is not in conflict with your goals. This is, I believe, one of the section headers of the book. It's really great point, and she's not the first to make it, but I love the formulation anyway. The truth is not in conflict with your goals. Reality is not in conflict with your goals. And that's not true for everyone, by the way, and she states it as if it is, but there are people who actually have goals that are anti-reality, anti-truth. And we can talk about another time how that goes. So the scout mindset is not just knowledge of the common cognitive biases that people engage in. It's not just knowledge of logic. It's turning into just a habitual mode of engaging with the world, of being very motivated to get at the facts. So a great example that Galef gives in the book is of Charles Darwin. And it's really interesting because Darwin at one point wrote to a friend saying that the sight of a peacock's tail made him feel ill. Why would that be? Well, in about 1860, about a year after he published On the Origin of Species, he was a pretty embattled man. He was getting flack from former friends and even mentors for the ideas that he put forth on evolution. And much of this was just silly ad hominem. But one particularly potent criticism that he came across was, what about the peacock's tail? Because if natural selection were, the sole means of explaining speciation and the development of species, the features that they have today, then this doesn't really seem to make sense, because here is this peacock. Its tail grows to sometimes 5 feet tall, which makes it a lot less mobile. And it's like a giant, although beautiful, it's like a giant target for predators. So what's going on here? This doesn't seem to aid this species in survival. And Darwin, he's like, wow, this is actually a really great question. What is going on here? But it made him sick because he had spent, decades at this point coming with mountains of evidence and going through just loads of testing his own theory, and he hadn't thought of this, and publishes it, and this objection comes out, and he doesn't know what to say to it. So for a long time, he's working on this project, and he had given himself a standing order, which was, let's see if I can pull it up here and read it, because this is really, I think, just a great ode to intellectual honesty, and also just a standing order that all of us can mimic. So here it is. He had resolved, whenever a published fact, a new observation or thought came across me, which was opposed to my general results, to make a memorandum of it without fail and at once. For I had found by experience that such facts and thoughts were far more apt to escape from the memory than favorable ones. So he's acknowledging here the very common tendency when we come across something that seems to contradict our thoughts, that it's sort of in one ear and out the other. And perhaps it does stay in our memory, but it's sort of altered and perhaps weakened. We have some sort of straw man memory of it, not of the real view. So when you do come across something that violates your expectations and seems to oppose what you currently believe, how do you respond to that? And Darwin is saying, well, we ought to make a note of that. And then he does this, makes a note of this. Obviously, it's more than a note. It's sort of seared into his memory. He's feeling ill at the sight of even the thought of the peacock's tail. And he spends the next 2 years, or several years, I actually don't know how many years, but I think it's about 2, working out why this would be the case. And it leads him to this sort of complexified version of his theory of speciation, leads him to a sort of more nuanced version. It's a sort of complementary theory of sexual selection. The idea being that perhaps a feature like the peacock's tail will make an animal less fit for the rigors of survival, but it might actually overbalance that by giving that species, that animal, a correspondingly greater reproductive advantage by, in this case, attracting more mates. So I like to think of more contemporary example, the rock star with the Lamborghini, for instance, might have a lower life expectancy than, say, your average accountant, but he's nonetheless likely to father more offspring. So Darwin made it a habit to leverage well-founded criticism, and he was able to use that to level up his theory. Instead of sort of, shoving it under the rug, he did what Galef calls in scout speak, updating. So a lot of times scouts will speak this way. Apparently, I've updated my idea. And it's not, oh, mea culpa, I was wrong. Let me basically get on the bullhorn and tell the world how wrong I was. There's actually like this inherent negativity to the way that we typically talk about updating our views, and that's what she's getting at here. It's not that you should avoid responsibility for having made errors. That's not the point. The point is that just the way that we talk about it is actually geared toward us digging our heels in on views that are actually wrong. And if we get in the habit of talking about updating our ideas instead, just like we update our operating systems all the time, there are new bugs that are coming out and we've got to figure out how to deal with them. Well, yeah, there's something similar that we can do with our ideas, and it's, acknowledging complexity, figuring out where we went wrong to begin with, and working that nuance into our views. So that's the idea of scout mindset. And then she actually gives some great tips on practicing it, because actually practicing scout mindset is what in time makes you a scout. It's what enables you to turn this mindset into a habit and continuously act on it. So she talks about some signs of a scout, some things, some typical behaviors, some scout behaviors. So one clear sign of a scout is telling other people when they are right and you're wrong. So you get into some sort of disagreement with somebody and you both sort of have different views on something, and that's the end of the conversation. You go away from the conversation, maybe you look something up, maybe you do a bit more thinking on it, and you realize that the other person was right. Well, do you fess up to that? Do you tell that person, oh, look, it turns out I was wrong? She gives us a great example of this. President Abraham Lincoln. I was just talking, 2 episodes ago with Cal Newport, who regards Lincoln as a hero and an intellectual exemplar. And part of why is Lincoln's intellectual honesty. So, for instance, Lincoln was not an expert military strategist. Luckily, he had Ulysses S. Grant, along with several others, during the Civil War. And at one point, he realizes that although he thought Grant's military strategy was wrong, well, in fact, Lincoln was wrong, and he writes him a letter apologizing, just saying, hey, it looks like actually you were right, and I just wanted to acknowledge that. So how often do you tell other people when you realize that they're actually right about something? Another indicator of a scout is similar to the first, but it's how do you react to personal criticism? Are you really defensive? Do you retaliate? Or do you welcome feedback? Take it calmly? Try to understand what the other person is saying and sort of engage in a dialogue about that feedback. Obviously, a lot of this has to do with how the person gives feedback. And if you want some tips on doing that in the context of a relationship, did an episode on relationships and relationship maintenance with my wife several episodes back. And we talked about the methods for giving feedback that we learned from the psychologist John Gottman. So I definitely recommend checking that out. So scouts tend to take personal criticism better because they know, okay, well, other people have perspectives and knowledge that I don't, and I'd like to benefit from that. And last of these signs of a scout that I want to go over right now is, do you ever prove yourself wrong? And Galef gives a cool example in the book. To paraphrase, essentially a female scientist who is a doctor, she has her doctorate, realizes that, well, she says that men are more likely than women to fail to use doctor in addressing her, specifically in email. And so she goes on a bit of a rant about this. I think it was on Twitter or something. And then she realizes actually that she goes back, she does the scientist thing. She goes back and actually counts the number of times that men and women both failed to use doctor when addressing her, and realizes that she was wrong, and makes that announcement publicly there on Twitter, saying, hey, actually I was wrong about this. Perhaps she could have said, hey, I need to update my view, but in this case that makes sense. So do you ever prove yourself wrong? It's a good question to ask if you want to really get at whether or not you're showing signs of a scout. Okay, now I want to skip ahead to another part of the book that I really, really like. It's a section wherein she details a bunch of different thought experiments that you can do to figure out, to really test whether or not you're being objective in your assessment of any given topic. And I've never really been a big fan of thought experiments. There's a great portrayal of the trolley problem in The Good Place. It's gruesome, but it's hilarious. And to me, that's always been like the most useful thing for a thought experiment, is just to make me laugh. They're most often used just to confound freshman philosophy students. I've never found them very useful. Not the case for the collection of thought experiments that Galef has put together in this book. Immediately found them useful, and hopefully you will too. So let's go through a couple of these, or a few. The first one that she goes through is called the double standard test. And the idea is to think back to the last time you disagreed with someone or criticized someone, maybe political disagreement, religious disagreement, just pick any controversial topic. And quoting now from the book, she asks, am I judging other people's behavior by a standard I wouldn't apply to myself? And she gives the example of a Democrat commenting back in 2009 about the Democrats' plan to abolish the filibuster. And this person was unhappy with what the Democrats were doing, even though this person was a Democrat. They weren't engaging in motivated reasoning. They were using this double standard test. And they basically said, well, if the Republicans were doing this, obviously we wouldn't be too happy about it. So we ought not really congratulate them in this case. This is a biased view. If you think, well, the Democrats are doing it, so it's good, then you're applying this double standard, because you wouldn't use the same standard if you were judging the Republicans. So that's the double standard test, pretty basic test of bias, but it's helpful to keep that one in mind. Another great test is called the outsider test. And if you've ever asked the question, what would Harry Potter do in this situation? Or what would Elon Musk do? Or what would any stranger, could be a friend, it could be a rival, could be a hero of yours, perhaps a fictional hero. What would that person do? Well, then you're engaging in the outsider test. You're asking, okay, what would this person with a different context do in my shoes? And am I being rational about this? She gives the example of a couple of founders of a tech company. I think it was, this probably is an Andy Grove's biography or something like that, if I recall correctly. And he and his other executive at the company are talking about what they ought to do. I mean, they're getting their lunch handed to them by, I believe it was Chinese competitors in their key market fields, their key products. And they say, okay, well, what if we were fired today and the board brought in new management? What's the first thing that new manager would do? And they're like, oh, well, that's easy. They would do X. Okay, well, why don't we do X? And then they go and do that, and then their company just blows up and they're very successful. So it's a great outcome for the outsider test. Another one that she talks about is the conformity test. So this is kind of funny. She talks about being a kid and really looking up to her cousin, I believe it was. And her cousin is like listening to whatever pop album was, top of the charts at that point, and saying, oh, well, this is my favorite song on this album. And Julia finds herself thinking, yeah, this is a great song. I think it's my favorite too. And then her cousin's like, just kidding, it's the worst song. And so she's like, this little girl, I forget, like 5 or 7 years old or something, put on the spot for sort of conforming to what her older, cooler, hipper cousin liked. And so she asks, she poses this conformity test. If you find yourself agreeing with some other person's view, imagine if that person now just flipped sides and said exactly the opposite. Would you still hold that view? Would you feel comfortable defending that view to another person? And this dovetails nicely with a phenomenon I believe I've talked about in previous episodes. We talked about independence with Michael Strong last episode, and another, the mirror image of that, or the counter image of that, I guess, is second-handedness, which is taking your views from other people and not thinking about them independently. So the conformity test is really designed to ask, well, am I thinking first-handed about this? Am I being independent about what I think about this? And if not, well, I ought to be. Okay, so those are just a few of the thought experiments that Julia Galef goes through in the Scout Mindset. And, we covered a handful of ideas, all of which I find really, really helpful. I think this is an exciting book, and I plan to try to apply these ideas to my own life more in 2022, try to habitualize them more, turn Scout Mindset into second nature, and hopefully you do the same. So check out Scout Mindset by Julia Galef and let me know what you think. You can hit me up with questions or comments at john@theobjectivestandard.com, john@theobjectivestandard.com. Until next time, happy flourishing.